We're now really pleased to have Kasper Lippert-Rasmussen here. I'll remind you all before we start to please keep your microphones muted, but do keep your camera on if you'd like to, because it's nice to see a couple of faces out there in the audience. So Kasper is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Aarhus. Kasper's research centers on social and political philosophy, ethics and applied philosophy. And today he's giving a talk entitled A Puzzle About Disability and Old Age. So delighted to have you here, Kasper, and I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks, Harriet, for this invitation to present something at your workshop. So if you would allow me a slightly jokey introduction, because I don't have any jokes as we go through the slides. One reaction that I've often got when I've presented this paper is that there's an obvious reason why I'm interested in this topic, which is that I'm not getting younger. Just two thoughts in that connection. Interestingly, I'm not sure that I've gotten this reaction had I been disabled. I wouldn't go as far as to say that that sort of reaction represents a kind of epistemic injustice against me. But still, I think it's interesting. And the second point is that I did actually enter this topic because I was a handling editor of a manuscript on disability, which I thought was really brilliant, but I also felt that I had some disagreements with some of the central claims. And at least that's how I tell myself that I've begun to develop an interest in this kind of topic, but still there might be other reasons of which I'm not aware. So what I'm going to do in the talk is to first present you with three different claims. Then I'm going to put them together and try to convince you that we have to reject at least one of them. And then I'll go through the three different claims again, suggesting that it's not really very clear that we should reject any of them, which is a problem because they form an inconsistent set. And then I'll end with some reflections on what we should think about this trilemmatic situation. So the first claim I will introduce to you is the mere difference view about disability. And the mere difference view about disability, I think it's fair to say that this has had a tremendous influence on thinking about disability in philosophy and medicine over the last 50 years or so. And often when people introduce that view, they start by contrasting it with what we could call the bad difference view about disability. So on the bad difference view about disability, disabilities are a special kind of bodily or mental dysfunctions. They are worse for the disabled person in themselves, that is, irrespective of whatever social environment the person finds him or herself in. And therefore, it should be mitigated or eliminated through medical interventions. I guess the third item of the bad difference view about disability is not one that I think strictly follows in any sense from the two other claims, but it is often somehow thought that the first two claims are a natural motivation for the third claim, but I'm not going to put much emphasis on this in what follows. I think what we've learned from what you're probably familiar with under the label of the social model of disability is that the bad difference view about disability overlooks the crucial role of ableism in connection with the disadvantages involved in disabilities. So to take one standard example, the difference between getting around in a social space where there's wheelchair access to buildings and one in which there's not makes a huge difference to whether or not it's a disadvantage to be a wheelchair user. So simply to say that being a wheelchair user or having some movement disabilities is a special bodily dysfunction and it is worse for the disabled person, whatever the social environment, seems like a false thing to claim. So people who've been persuaded by this sort of considerations often subscribe to what we could call the mere difference view of disability. It's a label that I borrowed from Elizabeth Barnes. According to this view, being disabled is not worse in itself for the disabled person than being able-bodied. It's merely different, hence the name. And to the extent that it's worse, this is due not to the disability to itself, but to the fact that the person lives in an ableist social environment. And an ableist social environment is one in which the social environment is geared to accommodate the needs and bodies of able-bodied people, and for that reason, there will be a lot of situations where disabled people find that the social world is not geared to their needs or abilities. Just a brief note on how the mere difference view about disability is related to the social model of disability. So clearly there's a tight connection here. I guess strictly speaking, the social model of disability is a theory about the nature of disability, whereas the mere difference view of disability is a view about the disadvantage involved in disability. So they are related, but they are, strictly speaking, different. So that's the first claim. The second claim is what we could call the bad difference view of old age. So here's a bad difference view of old age. Being old is worse in itself and not merely different for the old person than being young. And to the extent that it is worse, this is due in part, at least, to old age in itself, and not just to the fact that the person lives in an ageist social environment. And here's an example of that would correspond to the bad difference view of disability. And here's an example of a theorist who subscribes to this view about old age, Hauskiller. He says, in aging, we experience the gradual disintegration of our bodies and often enough our minds. Taken by itself, this really is bad for us. That is, our aging is bad for you and mine for me. I think strikingly, I haven't come across any theorist who, so to speak, discusses the parallel between the distinction between the mere difference and the bad difference view of disability on the one hand, and the bad difference view of old age and the mere difference view of old age. And certainly there's not been any transition over the last half century in the view of old age compared to the view of disability, where people have come to embrace something like the mere difference view of old age. On that view, being old is not worse in itself for the old person than being young. It's merely different. And to the extent that it is worse, this is due not to old age itself, but to an ageist social environment. And just one thing I should mention here is that when I talk about old age being bad in itself for the old person, than if this person was young, I don't have in mind, so to speak, the prospect of death, which obviously is something aging is correlated with, in the sense that you're much more likely to die when you're old than when you're young. That is, so to speak, an effect of being old, but it's not a badness of being old in itself. And I'm interested here in the badness of being old rather than, so to speak, the badness of things that being old causally disposes you to be subjected to. So that's the second claim. And the third claim is what I'll call the BI-CONDITIONAL. And the BI-CONDITIONAL says that if and only if the mere difference view about disability is true, then so is the mere difference view about old age. So what that claim says is simply that if disability is not in itself bad for the disabled person, then the same is true of being old. And one way of supporting that BI-CONDITIONAL would be to point to the fact that, in fact, one very important feature of what is disadvantageous about old age is that generally it involves developing disabilities or conditions similar to disabilities. So, for instance, old people are much more likely to be deaf than young people, and even old people who are not deaf typically have reduced hearing compared to what they had when they were young. Reduced hearing might not be a disability, at least not within a certain spectrum, but still it's a condition very similar to the disability of being disabled. And it would seem odd to say that the condition of being deaf simply depends on the social environment in which you live, whereas the badness of having reduced hearing, but not to such a level that you're disabled, does not simply depend on the social environment in which you live. So suppose that you accept all these three claims, and I tend to think that many people would actually have some inclination to initially accept all these three claims. Then we can put them together, and what we then realize is that they form an inconsistent set. So we cannot consistently affirm all three claims. So if we can accept any two of them, but then we would have to reject the third of them. So we could, for instance, reject the mere difference view about disability, but if we then also accept the biconditional, then we would also have to accept the mere difference view of old age. So we would have to reject the bad difference view of old age. And similarly, if we accept the bad difference view of old age, which I tend to think that most people would unreflectively do, and we accept the biconditional, then we would have to say that disabilities are bad for the disabled person, not simply because of the fact that the person lives in an ableist social environment. So what this means is that even though we might be attracted to all of these three claims, they cannot all be true. So one of them must be rejected. So the question then arises, which one of them, perhaps all of them, but at least one of them we will have to reject. So what I'll be doing next is to go through all these three claims again to see if on reflection we should reject one of them. So let's start with the bad difference view of old age. And I think if you have some sympathy, as I think many people have, for the mere difference view about disability, perhaps one's initial favorite option would be to say that on reflection we should revise our views about whether or not being old is bad for you or not. But I do not think that this is really a viable option out of the trilemma, and here's some reasons why not. So first, suppose that somebody offers you an anti-aging pill. So suppose that you're offered a pill, there are no side effects from eating the pill, you offered it for free. It will make sure that your body and your mind will stay in the condition that of your 30-year-old self for the rest of your life. It won't prolong your life, you'll still die at the same time you would die if your body aged, but you would continue enjoying the body and mind that you have at the age of 30. And also, in order to make this a fair test, let's suppose that many of the anti-old ageist features of the social world we live in are removed. And what I would suspect is that very few people would not take the anti-aging pill in that scenario. And if that's so, that's at least some support for the claim that people do think that becoming old is bad for them. Now, some people will object to this, and that's the second point, that old age is a part of a well-rounded life, and for that reason it plays a certain role in a good life, and if you take that away, then that's bad for you. But I don't think that really defeats the bad difference view of old age, because defenders of the bad difference view of old age need not deny that in some respects, aging, biologically speaking, is good for us. However, they will say that these advantages are outweighed by the disadvantages of old age. And perhaps one could live, I'm actually pretty sure that one could live a well-rounded life in the sense that these objectives have in mind, even without many of the disadvantages that follow with being old age. So if, for instance, your hearing at the age of 80 was the same as your hearing at the age of 30, I don't think that you would, on that account, have a less well-rounded life than otherwise. A third reason why I think we should accept the bad difference view is that we should understand the claim as involving a generic as opposed to a universal generalization. By the way, just as is the case with the mere difference view of disability. So a generic generalization differs from a universal generalization in the sense that you could have some instances of the generalization which, so to speak, are not true, even though that does not falsify the generalization. So for instance, an example of a generic generalization would be ticks are dangerous. Most ticks are, as a matter of fact, not dangerous because most ticks will not infect you with the Lyme's disease. But there are enough ticks that are dangerous and can affect you with Lyme's disease so that we think that the generic generalization ticks are dangerous is true. So we don't understand this as a universal generalization. And similarly, I think we should understand the bad difference view of old age as a generic generalization. It doesn't imply that for any old person, that person is worse off as a result of being old. We should understand it as a claim about what's generally true about old people. And that makes it harder to defeat. Now, some might object that, and that's the fourth source of support for the bad difference view. Some people might object that what is really meant by bad in itself here, and they might reasonably point out that there are different senses of age. So you have a chronological sense. So that's basically a matter of how many years you've existed. There's a biological sense. So that's a matter of, so to speak, whether your body and mind has the shape that it has, that's typical for a certain age. So you might have a biological age of, say, 60, even if you're 40, if you've been very unfortunate or lived a very unhealthy life. And finally, there's also age in an experiential sense. For most people, age in an experiential sense follows their chronological age. But if you've, say, spent 10 years in coma, for instance, your age in an experiential sense will be lower than your chronological age. And certainly it's plausible to claim that being old in a chronological sense is not in itself bad for you. It's obviously bad for you in the sense that you have, statistically speaking, fewer years left to live in, but it's not bad in itself. But the problem here is that I think basically the same thing could be said about any disability. So being paralyzed, for instance, is that bad for you? Well, it's not bad for you in itself because, say, had you some kind of sci-fi automatic device that's controlled by your intentions, such that whenever you intend to move your body in a certain way, then that internal mechanical device will make sure that you move your body in the way you want to. So it's not bad for you that you're paralyzed. That just shows that when people say that disabilities are not bad in themselves, they have a loose sense of in itself in mind. And I think the same is true here of old age. So what we should understand by that is that old age or disability is bad in itself. That means that across all feasible social conditions and norms, it is bad for you to have the relevant disability or being old. So perhaps we should reject the biconditional if we cannot get rid of the bad view claim of old age. But I think the main problem here is that, as I mentioned, many of the disadvantages involved in old age and disability are essentially the same or of the same kind. And that makes a difference to say that those that are associated with disability are not bad in themselves, whereas it's different with old age. So perhaps we can point to some ways in which old age and disability differ, and surely there are lots of ways in which the two differ. So for instance, unless one dies prematurely, one will eventually become old. The same is not true of being disabled. It's not the case that unless one dies prematurely, one will eventually become disabled, even though it's becoming much more likely that you will become it. And similarly, one might be disabled at some point in time and then at a later point in time not be disabled. But it's not the case that one can be old at some point in time and then at some later point in time not be old. So that's a way in which old age and disability differ. But all of this is consistent with the BI-CONDITIONAL claim, which doesn't claim that old age and disability are not different at all. It just says, it just speaks to, so to speak, the disadvantages that the two involve. So perhaps one might suggest here that disability involves disadvantages of one kind, while old age involves disadvantages of a different kind, in addition to disabilities. And where the differences between those two kinds of disadvantages are such that it's plausible that the former are non-existent under some feasible social circumstances, while the latter exist whichever feasible social circumstances obtain. But I think this is very unlikely to be true, and one reason why this is, and I'm in the interest of time, I'm skipping the first point and moving on to the second. And the reason is that disabilities are really diverse. So here's a list from Americans with a Disability Act: muscular dystrophy, orthopedic, speech and hearing impairments, visual impairments, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, mental retardation, HIV, specific learning disabilities, and diabetes. It seems to me that there's not really any unifying disadvantage across all these different forms of disability, which, so to speak, could make it true that most forms of disability involve a particular kind of disadvantage, which are unique to disability as opposed to old age. I think probably the best shot one could have at this point would be to say that there are certain stereotypes involved in being disabled. But it's certainly also the case that there are lots of stereotypes about old people, like middle-aged people and young people. So I don't think that there's a relevant difference here. So perhaps what this comes down to, if you accept my arguments for why it's not easy to reject the first two claims, is that we should end up rejecting the mere difference view about disability. And here's what Tom Shakespeare, a disability theorist, says. What would it mean to create a barrier-free utopia for people with learning disabilities? Reading and writing and other cognitive abilities are required for full participation in many areas of contemporary life in developed nations. What about people on the autistic spectrum who may find social contact difficult to cope with? With many solutions to the disability problem, the concept of addressing special needs seem more coherent than the concept of a barrier-free utopia. And I think to this one could add that it's very hard to see how having a severe depression for a prolonged period of time could, under some feasible social circumstances, not be bad for you. So to me, this suggests that perhaps we should reject the mere difference view of disability. But there are different ways of doing that. I mean, there are, I think, some very important insights in the social model of disability that we should not lose. And that suggests that we should, I would say, distinguish between what we could call mitigable and immitigable disabilities. And the latter are extreme forms of disability, say complete paralysis or severe prolonged depression, where the disadvantage is largely unaffected by and very significant, whatever the social environment. But there are other disabilities, like being a wheelchair user, which are mitigable in the sense that we could easily imagine social circumstances in which there are no disadvantages or only relative minor disadvantages involved in being disabled in that sense. So instead of the mere difference view, we could affirm what I call the narrow mere difference view about disability. And that is a more modest claim about disability. It says that being mitigatively disabled is not worse in itself for the disabled person than being able-bodied. It's merely different. And to the extent that it is worse, this is due not to the disability, but to an ableist social environment. The problem here is that while this view might be more plausible than the mere difference view, it doesn't extract us from our trilemmatic predicament, because we can simply formulate a new trilemma, which is a bit like the original one. So we substitute the narrow mere difference view about disabilities for the initial claim about disabilities, and we substitute the narrow bad difference view about old age for the original claim. So the narrow view about disadvantages involved in old age say, well, perhaps it's the case that if you are in a condition in which corresponds to the condition which most 90-year-old plus people are in, then that is bad for you, whatever the social circumstances. But it's not true of the sort of condition that you're in when you are, say, from 60 to 70, that these are bad for you, whatever the social circumstances you're in. So you make a more modest claim on part of the badness of old age. And then you substitute a biconditional that pertains to these two claims. And what I would suggest is that, like with the original trilemma, not all these three claims can be true. And perhaps rejecting one of them is easier than in the original trilemma. It seems that the first leg of the trilemma is stronger than the last two legs. But still, in my view, I think even the narrow view about the bad difference view about old age is true, and similar with the narrow biconditional claim. So I guess this is quite a negative conclusion in the sense that it seems that we end up with, I've not really offered you a way out of this trilemma. So what I'll be doing in the last 2 or 3 minutes is just to reflect on what that might tell us. So basically, I have 3 messages that I want to get across in this talk. And the first one is that how we think about the mere difference view in relation to disability constraint, how we must think about similar views in relation to old age and vice versa. So that's the first point, and it's a kind of formal point. It doesn't say anything about disability. It doesn't say anything about the nature of disadvantages in old age. It simply says that we should think about disability and old age in parallel, and what we say about one constrains what we can say about the other. And I think that's a fact that has been overlooked in the literature. The second point is that I think that once we realize this, then many of us will be forced to revise the ways in which we think about either disability or old age, or for that matter, both. So I suspect that many disability theorists, to the extent that they've given this any thought, would actually subscribe to the bad difference view of old age. And for them, I think the trilemma shows that they have to revise some of their views. And note here that I've not defended any particular way out of the trilemma, though I think, so full disclosure, I think I subscribe to the view that the bad difference view of old age is it's really hard to see why we should reject that view. The third claim that I want to get across in this talk is that perhaps the lesson to learn from my discussion of the trilemma is that the trilemma makes us ask the wrong sort of questions about disability and old age. So instead of focusing on which of the three claims in the trilemma we should reject, we should take a critical look at the way in which the trilemma is formulated. So, as I've already said, disability is a very broad and extremely varied phenomena, and the same could be said about being of old age. And perhaps we should expect that asking the sort of questions about whether very broad and varied phenomena like that, or like being a teenager or having a personality that is in every way statistically ordinary, that we can ask those sorts of questions, but we don't really, there's not much we can do with the answers we get to those sorts of questions. And recall that the disability and the old age legs in the trilemma are all generic generalizations. So that means that even if the mere difference view of disability is true, then that would be consistent with some, perhaps even many disabilities being to some degree bad for the disabled person, to some degree independently of the social environment. And similarly, the bad difference view of old age might be true, even if many of the disadvantages that are involved in old age are completely non-existent in non-ageist social environments. So if we look at the mere difference view of disability and the bad difference view of old age from the perspective of a social reformer, it's not really so important whether these generic generalizations about the disadvantages involved in complex and varied conditions like disability and old age are true. What's much more interesting is to look at specific disadvantages that typically adhere to disabled people of a particular kind, or old people of a particular kind, and see whether we can modify social circumstances in order to address those disadvantages. Now, this is consistent with saying that generic generalizations can be used for good or bad for political purposes. And I think actually in the case of the disability movement, the claim that disability is not bad in itself for disabled people is simply a matter of disabled people living in an ableist social environment, which is bad for them, has had a very important political use, and I would say that it's been a good thing because it's improved the conditions of disabled people. But I think that we should look at the philosophy of medicine, at least not only as a political enterprise, and that, so to speak, we can conduct the sort of analysis that I've suggested here, setting aside whatever political use the kind of generic generalizations we're talking about here might or might not have. So that's the end of the talk. So thanks for listening.